expecting every time. Genesis chapter number 32, beginning at verse number 24. We'd like for you to read with me all the way down to verse number 32, if you will. Genesis chapter 32, verse 24 through 32. And you may stand in the presence of the Lord. If you have that, let us begin reading in the King James out loud. It says, "And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except you bless me. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank. May God bless the reading of his word on today. And we're going to use for a subject title this morning, Wrestling for a Breakthrough. Come on, somebody say out loud with me, say wrestling for a breakthrough. Come on, now I know all of you have had some times in your life where you felt like you were just wrestling with something. Some of you have come in here today wrestling with something. And we need to understand that there's a time that you can wrestle and wrestle and wrestle. And if you wrestle the right way, you can get a breakthrough. Come on now, but some wrestling is unnecessary. Some wrestling we do in our lives will bring on some trouble and trials that I would consider unnecessary. We look at Jacob here in verse number 24, which is my theme verse in this message. It says, And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Jacob was wrestling in this scenario alone with a man. It just says a man. Now, what was going on? As you understand, Jacob had some unfinished business with his brother Esau. Many things had happened between the time that Jacob had wrestled in the womb with his brother Esau. Before he was born, Jacob was wrestling. And it has come up to this point that something different was about to happen in his life. And he's wrestling once again. He was taking his family and all of his wealth and everything that he had gained back at his father-in-law Laban's house. And he was about to go back to his homeland where he was raised so that he could meet with his brother Esau to reconcile. Because some things had happened in Jacob's past that Jacob realized, I got to go back and deal with my past. Now, this thing about wrestling, I used to watch wrestling back when I was a little boy. Some of you might be familiar with a time when Montgomery had wrestling teams and professional wrestling was in the area. I see some heads nodding around here. When I used to go to the wrestling matches, man, it would be an exciting Saturday night. And we would watch wrestling on TV whenever we couldn't go to the wrestling matches. And so back then, some of y'all might remember some of those famous wrestlers in the day. You know, they had Buddy Wayne and what was it, Jimmy Golden and Burrhead Jones and all those guys. You know, and they would be in the wrestling ring and we'd be rooting for them. Oh my goodness. And me and my cousin, you know, we would wrestle in the yard sometimes, you know, because after we watched wrestling, man, we would put each other in a submission hold and sleeping hold and all of this kind of thing. Everything that we saw on television, we were trying to mimic that. Man, we would go to those wrestling matches. And sometimes the audience would get so upset with the wrestling that they would start taking chairs and throwing them in the ring. One time we were at the arena in Selma, and they were out there wrestling, and the good guy, we would always say we want the good guy to win. And so sometimes when it looked like the good guy wasn't winning and looked like they would be beating them in the head and blood coming out and all of this, and people got to throwing chairs into the ring, and so they had to stop the wrestling going on. Why were we carrying on like that? One of the reasons is because we enjoyed the violence, but we also believed that it was real. That was the real reason is that we would go, because we thought it was real. We didn't realize that these are actors basically on the stage. And the reason sometimes the good guy would lose, it would be because they wanted you to come back the next week and keep you in suspense. And I would get so upset. I'm saying, that guy right there, I know he's stronger. I know he's better. I know he's got more skill. Why in the world did they come all the way up to the point of the end of the match and now he lost the wrestling match? Boy, I'd be so mad when he loses. And it was only later on that I found out that the wrestling matches were rigged. They already had the winner chosen before the wrestling match ever started. And so this thing was rigged. It was already set up. And it was only to keep the audience excited so that the audience could come back over and over and over again. So now, what about the things that's going on in our lives? When we're wrestling, is the match already rigged? What about who's going to win this thing? Sometimes God allows you to wrestle. Let's go back and look at Jacob just a little bit. We mentioned earlier that Jacob was wrestling even in the womb because his mother, Rebekah, had received a word of prophecy about the two children, the twins that was in her womb. She was about to have a very difficult childbirth. And it was very painful for her. And there was just so much going on within her. She was ready to deliver. But there was wrestling going on. And we find out that the word of prophecy to her was that there are two nations within you. And when there are two nations within you and they're wrestling, it just means that the older is going to serve the younger. Now, in those days, they knew that the oldest child would always be the one that would receive the inheritance of the father. He would receive something called the birthright. And the father would bless the oldest child with the position of leadership. Once the father would pass away, he would have an inheritance for his children, but the oldest child would get what is called the birthright, the position of leadership in the family. He would be the one that would make the distribution of goods in the family. So he would take over where the father would leave off. So that was traditionally the position of the oldest child. And so it would be in the mind of of Isaac, who was the children's father. Isaac had his favorite, and his favorite was Esau. But his wife Rebekah had a favorite, and her favorite was Jacob. And so Esau was a man's man. Esau liked to go hunting. And his father loved for him to go hunting because he could always go out there and bring back some good wild game. And they would cook it up and his father would eat it and he would enjoy that. Jacob, of course, was the mama's boy. Jacob hung around his mama's skirt and stayed in the kitchen most of the time. And wherever his mama wanted to go, because she didn't have a daughter. So Jacob was more like her daughter. Jacob would stay under his mama a lot. So therefore, Jacob learned how to cook. And Jacob was cooking one day when his brother came home from the hunt. And Jacob began to stir that stew that he was cooking. And Esau came in and Esau was hungry. He had been out all day and hadn't caught anything. But he had to come home, and from a distance he could smell that stew. So he comes and he's like, oh, I'm famished. I'm ready to eat, and I'm smelling that good old stew. Oh, Jacob. Oh, I'm glad you cooked this today because I'm ready to eat now. Well, Jacob, he was a kind of interesting character because his name means supplanter. Supplanter means trickster. And when they would name the children would carry out their namesake by growing up, and they would really be the character of whatever their name is. So whatever their name would be, that's what that person would be like. So for some reason, he had the name of Jacob, which means supplanter, trickster. Now, Jacob began to stir this stew up when his brother showed up. And his brother comes there and he said, Jacob, let me have some of that stew. And if you know the story, you'll know that Esau said, yes, I would love to have some of that stew. Come on, give me some of that stew. And Jacob said, I know you want some, but I would like your birthright. And he said, birthright? What's that to me when I'm about to starve to death? He said, well, if you'll let me have your birthright, then I'll let you have some food. And Esau let him give him that stew. He got a bowl of stew, and he said, now you can have my birthright. It don't mean anything to me. Esau despised his birthright because he just wanted something to eat. It didn't mean anything to him. How many of you know that God can give you something that is so wonderful and so good, but if you don't receive it and accept it and handle it the right way, then you lose what is actually meant for you. Amen. And on the other hand, here's Jacob. Jacob tricked him out of his birthright. And what was Jacob doing? Jacob knew of this prophecy, most likely. I'm sure his mother said, Jacob, your brother is going to serve you. In other words, your children are going to be the ones who will be the leader. You're going to take the place of your brother in the family. Well, instead of him just letting God have his way, Jacob decided to step in and help God out. How many of you have stepped in to try to help God out? You might know that there is something that God has in store for you. You might know that there's been a prophetic message about your destiny. You might know that there is something good ahead of you. But instead of you waiting and let God work it out and orchestrate things in your life, you decide that you're going to step in there and try to help God out. And that's what Jacob began to do. He used his skills of trickery to trick his brother out of his birthright. His mother was also a trickster. And because she favored Jacob, she began to put things in his mind. So you can also get the blessing that was meant for Esau, and your father will give you the blessing. Well, how are we going to do that, Mama? Well, here's what we're going to do. Now that your dad is on his sick bed and he's possibly going to die soon, he is going to be ready to give that blessing over to your brother Esau. But I don't want you to be left without. I want you to get the blessing. And here's how we're going to do it. So he began to disguise himself as his brother Esau because his father had gone blind. And so he figured, along with his mother, as they conspired together, that if he could disguise himself as his brother Esau, that he would go in there and his father would give him the blessing. Well, they chose a day that Esau would go out hunting. And his father said, all right, Esau goes out hunting, today is the day. When he comes back and bring me some of that good old venison, I'm going to be here ready to give him his life blessing. And this life blessing is something that they had to speak over their children. You have to speak over your children. He was going to speak over his son, and what he speak over him would be a prophetic word, and that would be how God would set the course of his destiny. Because the father speaks destiny to the son. And so what would happen is that he would think that Esau was going to come in, bring him the food, and when he is eating of that food, that then he would give him a great blessing. But instead of waiting for Esau to come back, Jacob had disguised himself as his brother because his brother was hairy. He went and got some of his brother's clothes and put them on. And they got some skin from an animal and put it on his arms so that it would feel hairy. And so when he went in with some food, his father began to eat of the food and say, oh, this sure is good. And he said, Esau, is that you? He says, yes, father, it is I. He said, the voice sounds like Jacob. Come over and let me feel you. So he began to touch him. He said, you're hairy. Feels like Esau. Let me smell your clothes. He smells his clothes. His clothes smells like Esau. I guess it must be Esau. But you sure sound like Jacob. Well, anyway, let me go ahead and bless you. So he blessed him, and he spoke the blessing over his son, Jacob. And remember now, the blessing is not something that you can just take back. Whatever he spoke upon him, that is the way it's going to be. Amen. Jacob, once again, deceived, and he tricked, used trickery to get what actually belonged to his brother, and he received it himself. Yeah. So he goes out. Esau comes in. Esau finds out that there's no blessing left for him. Esau gets angry. He goes out, and Rebekah said, Jacob, get out of town, brother. Son, I want you to go to my brother's house back in Haran, and I want you to go there, and that's where you're going to find your wife. Get away, because Esau wants to kill you. Esau was so angry about it that Esau took of himself Canaanite women, and he married women who was outside of their family. And at that time, remember, they had to marry within the family. So now Jacob is gone. Jacob is left, and he has an encounter with God at a place called Bethel, where he saw in a vision angels ascending and descending to heaven up a ladder and up and down a ladder. And at this point, God began to deal with Jacob. Now, Jacob continues on his journey. And you can go and read this for yourself, because I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Just understand now, everything that Jacob is doing up to this point, he's actually wrestling, because he's wrestling with his true identity. Because his father now has spoken the destiny upon his brother, but he actually spoke it on Jacob. And so Jacob now has got to figure out, now who am I? I got everything that belongs to my brother, but now I got to figure it out. Who am I? So I'm going to go and get married. He finds the wife that he wants in the daughter of Laban, his uncle, and her name is Rachel. And so he says he would work, and he agreed to work for Rachel for 7 years. Laban agreed, all right, you can work for your wife for 7 years. He worked for 7 years, and it seemed like to him just a short period of time. It was time that he would get married. And so on his wedding night, he has his wife with him. He wakes up the next morning, and realizes that this is not Rachel. This is not the woman that I was in love with. This is not the one that I thought, wait a minute, so he leaves the tent, he's angry, he runs to his uncle Laban and said, what have you done to me? Why have you tricked me? Laban said, well, in our culture, the oldest daughter has to get married first. So the one that you laid with was not Rachel, that's Leah, my oldest daughter. And she probably wasn't going to get married anyway because all the men around here figure that she's hard to look at. In other words, Leah wasn't all that pretty. And Rachel, she's beautiful. And so you're gonna have to have Leah because she's the oldest. He said, no, that's not fair. It's just not right. I work for you for Rachel. He said, you can still have Rachel if you work another 7 years. So he was willing to work another 7 years for Rachel because he loved her so much. Now, this is the way things were going with Jacob and between him and his father-in-law Esau. Over the years, he was married now to these two women. Not only was Jacob wrestling, but Jacob's wives were wrestling with each other. They were in competition because Leah was having babies and Rachel wasn't having any. Rachel was barren. And so now there's wrestling going on within his family. I mean, if you realize that most of us, especially men, I know y'all are used to competition. That's the way we live our lives many times, in competition. When we're little boys, we compete with each other. And when we get a little older, we compete in sports. And when we're competing in sports, then we learn to compete in other areas. We compete as we get older. We compete for jobs. We compete for careers. We compete even sometimes in our marriages. Sometimes you find yourself competing with your spouse. Does God want us competing? That wrestling is down in all of us. There's this spirit, this idea of I got to get over. I got to get the best of somebody. In order for me to achieve, in order for me to get high positions, I got to wrestle. I got to tussle. I got to compete. And so this competition is there and this wrestling is going on. And sometimes even as Christians, we get to the place of where we're still wrestling. Why? Because the enemy has given us a mindset that I always got to be one up on somebody else. And we've got to realize who we're wrestling with and why are we wrestling before we can come to the point of understanding who we really are. Let me help you to understand something again in looking at the life of Jacob. Jacob was in competition now with his uncle Laban. And Jacob had learned how to be a professional trickster. He was gaining prosperity. He had all these children with Leah and Rachel, and then their midwives, or rather their maids, began to have children with him. He had concubines with Rachel's concubine, or rather the woman who was her maid, and then also the maid of Leah. And so they would become his concubines. And so now he's got these 12 boys, and they're growing up. And so he's got these children, and he is prospering, and he is growing, and he's got many flocks. He's got many children. Everything that Jacob touched was blessed. Why? Because his father spoke that blessing on him. No matter what he would do, he would be blessed, he would be prosperous. Now, he was blessed, he was prosperous, but Jacob wasn't happy. He wasn't happy. There were still many things that was going on within him. Though he had material goods, he was still not a happy man. Because he had an estranged relationship with Laban. And with his wives, they were competing with each other. And so when he would go home, there was still the struggle going on in his home. There was struggling going on between his children. They had competitions with each other. They were wrestling. His wives were wrestling. Now he's wrestling with Laban. And Laban saying, well, man, I know that I'm blessed because of you. Because you're a man who has integrity, a man who is honest. And I know that the blessing of God is on you. And so the only reason I'm blessed is because of you. I know that. I want you to stay and work for me continuously. And Jacob said, no, I'm going to have to take my family and we're going to have to leave here. Right. He said, well, I've been keeping your flock, and all the ones that I have, they're fatter and they're more healthy than the ones that you have. But I have very few. And so Laban and Jacob if they were going to part ways, Jacob said, listen, I will take only those that are spotted and those that are streaked, and those would be mine. And you can have all the ones that were solid color. Right. And so he said, well, I'll agree with that. So now he looks among them. He finds that there are some that are feeble and some that are strong. And so Jacob would divide his flocks with the flocks of Laban. And so when Jacob decided that he would take those that were streaked and those that were spotted, then it would seem like it would only be a few of those because there weren't but a few out there. So he would keep the flock. And then what happened was, whenever they went down to the watering trough, that's where all of the flock would start to mate. Jacob had learned this trick, that if he were to get some reeds from some trees and begin to cut the bark off of them and cause the white to show, then he would put them before the flock as they were mating. And when he put them before the flock as they were mating, guess what? He would notice that the majority of them were coming out streaked and spotted. And the ones that were strong, he would always get them together.